Welcome aboard the Workplace Whiz, your audio gateway to the modern workplace. We designed this podcast as the place to discuss strategies, best practices, and share industry insights with our expert guests. This program is brought to you by Yarums, the workplace experience platform. I'm Cosmin Patlageanu, marketing professional and published author. Today, we are discussing a very timely topic: how to convert return to office anxiety into positive change. And with me today, I have Bex Moorhouse. Bex is the founder and director of Invigorate Spaces Limited, a well-being consultancy that breathes life into the corporate world through careful curation of workplace culture, environment, and experiences. With more than 20 years of experience in creating and managing exceptional workspaces and well-being programs, she helps clients normalize well-being and attract and retain the best talent. Bex previously worked at Nike, where she was a workplace design and connectivity director for EMEA West and the chief of staff for the EMEA WD plus C leadership team. So thank you, Bex, for joining us today. What I want to talk about mainly is how do we actually convert this return to office anxiety in a positive change? So not everyone is back to the office just yet. Some people or some companies talk about it in terms of, the future of work. Some other companies, the big names are in this category, have announced the office 5 days a week for some employees, and probably more will follow. We don't know for sure. But there is also a thing with companies who are already in some kind of a hybrid model, and they are now pushing for more office time with policies like work from home, but whoever is working from home shouldn't necessarily be expecting promotions and things like that, or they would be strictly monitored. And there is a lot of anxiety around this, and we've had also a lot of conversations in the past. And sure enough, people have different opinions, obviously. And some companies just decided to go with the flow. Some others say everybody back to work. And I think you can actually help us, shed some light on what's going on when some companies decide to do it, and what's the proper fashion to do so. So just talking about this return to office anxiety, how does return to office manifest across organizations? Have you seen some red threads? Is it something that you've noticed?
Yeah, of course. Listen, thank you as well for inviting me here to chat today. It's really exciting to be here. I've seen return to office mandates done in kind of varying success, I suppose. I think the challenge comes is that sometimes when employers just decide, we're going to return to the office and this is what's going to happen. Some don't actually involve colleagues. And I think that's half of the challenge, that when colleagues feel like they've not been part of the decision, that's when anxiety can get worse as a result of being called back to the office, because it feels like it's been made without you being part of it, and therefore you have no control over the situation, and therefore it can come across maybe not in the best way. I've also seen companies sort of make that transition from maybe doing 1 day a week in office to suddenly saying 3 days a week in office, and it's happened overnight, almost like Friday night you go home and then from the Monday you do the 3 days a week, and it doesn't give colleagues enough time to plan and organise, what they were doing before at home. So it might have been like picking up the children from school, or it could have been caregiver responsibilities. It could have been anything that they've had to do. And suddenly with no kind of like ramp up to it, it kind of causes a lot of challenges. So I think that every organisation needs to decide, obviously, what the right approach is for them, and be swayed less by what other companies are doing, or, which seems to unfortunately be the case. It seems to be that the Googles, etc., are asking people to come back, and therefore everybody sort of starts doing the same thing to follow suit. But where I've seen things really successful is where teams have sat down and decided, if they are going to go into the office, what actually are they going to do when they're in the office? And do they have any flexibility, for example, around what days they go in, or are they being told to also go in? So whenever I work with organisations, I try to give as much empowerment to colleagues as possible. So it might be saying that you need to be in the office twice a week, but you can decide which day that is. Or it could be you have to be in 2 days a week, and these are the days that we need you in. And then again, you can plan around that. So I think it's more around having that conversation and building out what the new approach is, but doing it together. So doing it from a senior leadership and a team member perspective. And I'll be honest and say not so many companies do that in a collaborative fashion, which is why I think sometimes we get a lot of these problems. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So I was thinking about some of the companies that I've read about, and they've had this back to work mandate, like the third or the fourth iteration. So they've tried and failed in like a number of times. Why do you think that happens? I mean, is it still the communication bit? So because it's cascading from the top, saying, "Yeah, everybody back to work." The lack of perceived collaboration or involvement in the decision making process. What do you think?
I think there's a couple of things there. I mean, you referred to it as back to work, and some people, obviously organizations, are doing exactly the same, saying it's back to work. And that obviously affects colleagues because they were working at home as well, right? They weren't just suddenly stopping working and then coming back to the office and therefore working suddenly. So I think that terminology has to be sort of like communicated in a better way. So we need to talk about back to the office or back to base or back to home turf or whatever it might be, and kind of brand it in a better way. But secondly, I think not being part of the conversation doesn't help. And if you're a colleague and you're just being told what to do, it kind of feels like you're not being treated as an adult, I suppose. And that's what a lot of challenges are. Or should I say that causes a lot of challenges. So I think those are the main things, but also even thinking in terms of what each team does within an organization. So if you are, as you know, I work with quite large corporates, and everybody does completely different jobs within the same company. So there's some tasks that really do suit being at home. If you're a coder or something like that, you don't necessarily need to be with colleagues as much as, if you're a facilities manager. For example, you couldn't really be a facilities manager and stay at home if your job's to look after the building. So I think having a kind of like blanket top-down approach where everybody has to do the same thing, I think that's also what causes challenges, because not every kind of little mini team within a big organization is going to work in the same way. So those are the three sort of things that I would say cause the most challenges.
Absolutely. I love that point. When we talk about return to work, it's like everybody was on vacation and we're all gonna get back working on Monday. To that point, so I was looking through the some documents and policies saying we will return to working from the office. Let's call it, which is more like semantically correct. But the question is, on one hand, why do you do that? And second of all, if you do that, if you decide to bring people back to the office and ask them to work from there a number of days per week, what's behind it? Because what I've noticed, and it was something that we've been talking briefly about prior to recording this podcast, was the thing that I noticed. So some people do the same thing in the office as they would have done at home, right? So is there any real added value for, in this particular case, when you bring people back to working from the office, but then they do the same thing they would have done at home? And the ways that they can actually, isolate from the rest of the team or the rest of the company even, is like put on earphones, look busy, go into one of those, phone booths or one of the meeting rooms, and then just work from there, deep dive into some sort of topic.
Yeah. You know what? It's tough because I think for those individuals who are coming into the office like that and working like that, there could be a couple of reasons. One could be coming back to the office is actually a little bit anxiety inducing. There's too many people around. They're not used to being around people so much. And therefore, they're kind of moving themselves away to get a bit of like me time again, because it's a bit overwhelming with all the sensory. You know what it's like when you work in open plan offices, it can be a bit hectic sometimes. So it could be that people are just recharging and working as they need to kind of cope with the situation that they're in. But I do believe that probably the more prevalent reason is because the office space might not work for exactly how they want to work. Like it could be completely different to what they're used to working at home. And I think secondly, they probably haven't been through a change management program of coming back into the office and talking about what's the office for, what's the mission of the office, why are we coming in, and what are we going to do when we're in the office. So as a bit of a segue, when I work with clients, I always work through like team charters to agree what activities are going to happen in the office and why you would do those face to face as opposed to somewhere else. So things like the kind of transactional emails, working through spreadsheets, things like that, coding as an example, they'd all be things that I would advocate doing from home. Whereas the things that definitely you should be doing face to face are things like onboarding new starters, well-being check-ins to make sure that you can physically see the person. So when you ask, your teammate or a colleague, how are you doing? You can actually read the body language as well when they respond, not just take it, I'm fine, as an answer. And things like that, where you're doing reviews of people's performance, those are always the things that are better to do face-to-face. And a lot of organisations talk about coming into the office to collaborate and do all these different activities in the office, which is great. But again, are there spaces actually in the office to allow that to happen? Because most organisations during the pandemic have gone to open plan working and layout and got rid of a lot of meeting rooms and things like that. So sometimes the offices aren't necessarily built to kind of facilitate all of those things that you now need the office for. So yeah, a bit of a long-winded answer for you there, but hopefully gives you an idea.
No, absolutely. You mentioned change management, and it's probably not the first thing that companies think of when they decide to change the way, or not the way, but where people work from. And it's, funnily enough, when the thing that started everything, so the COVID outbreak, nobody thought of change management. It was like starting immediately everybody goes, but time has passed. Some call it, the future of work was going to happen in the future. The future kind of is right now. These issues, we are facing them, and companies are facing them right now. It's not something that is going to happen. It's happening already. And the question is, so from your perspective as a consultant, how do you bring into discussion the fact that there is a need for a proper change management process?
Yeah, no, of course.
In order for this to succeed.
Yeah, so with any change that happens, and it's unfortunately this is human nature, but usually a crisis forces a change. So it could be things in your personal life, like for example, if you're drinking and suddenly you're drinking a little bit too much, people always talk about the fact you have to get to a rock bottom before you make a change potentially, and it's always easier to make that change when you feel like things are either really bad or you're at risk, like it might be a life-threatening risk, etc. So when we look back to the pandemic, there was an absolute crisis happening there where our lives were actually in danger. So that whole thing of, as difficult as it was to make that adaptation, to move back to, to working from home when we hadn't done that before, it was in our DNA to follow what's right for us, i.e., you just follow because it's the safest thing to do. You're not going to argue with it. You might not like it, but you understand why you're doing it. On the flip side, now people have got used to their norm was working from home for 2 years. Obviously, that's all that people did. And now we need to try to reverse that and work through why you would go to the office, selling like why you would go to the office effectively. If you don't do change management, I honestly don't know how that's going to happen. I really feel like it would be a disaster because you need to understand that everybody's going through the change curve at different stages. Some people will have been affected by COVID in a bad way, like losing relatives, having trauma during that time, etc. And then we're just defaulting to saying, okay, everybody just jump back into our old world. Well, life has changed and life has evolved. And I think all of the technology that we now have means it's much easier also to work from home. So change management is so important because people need to understand and have the time and the hand-holding really to ask questions and to challenge like, well, why do I need to go in, and have those conversations. I think without that, what you'll end up with is all different people coming back to the office who are all at different stages in that change curve and just don't, you can hear the atmosphere is not as good as it should be when that change management hasn't happened. So yeah, that's usually how I would explain how important it is. And I think if you're independent, i.e. not working for the organisation, it's much easier to stay, I don't know how to put it, like in the middle. Like it doesn't bother me either way. Right. Do you know what I mean? I just want the best for you guys as a collective, and therefore I can be independent and stand there and kind of listen to both sides and be unemotional about it as well.
Yeah, I think communication has the most important part, and many times is not what companies do best, right?
Yeah.
We do have our roles saying internal communication. We got HR who sometimes is in charge of talking to people. Then you have top management talking to the others. So what's the best approach? I mean, speaking strictly of communication, what's the best approach? So then you can get some sort of buy-in from the people companies want to bring to the office.
Yeah, I think again with communication, you're right in what you say. I don't think it's just companies. I think as humans, we're really bad at communication just generally. There's a few things that we do generally, which is, when there's a bad message to deliver, sometimes we don't want to deliver it. And I think the unfortunate thing with return to office is delaying that message before it comes into effect is the worst thing you can do. So I think the longer road that you can give people to make that change, the better. So if you can start dropping into communications that this change is going to happen and this is why we're doing it and these are the benefits that we see, I think that's a really good approach. But I also think there's an opportunity to do like focus groups as well to communicate a message, to ask people, also to say, give people space to ask questions about why we're coming back, what's in it for us, etc., and to sort of sell that as well. And then in terms of the full communication, it's really important to tailor the communication according to the audience that it's going out to, and obviously get that flow correct. So the senior leader would usually send a message out, then the manager would send a message out, or the director of that area, and then the manager, etc., to make sure that each layer of communication is slightly different to tailor the correct information for the receiving audience. And again, you know what it's like in a big corporate. Usually people are very busy and it goes out last minute. It's the last thing that they have on their plate to do. And it might even go out at 9:00 at night. And it might even be referenced in something like, we're doing this for your well-being, and the person sending it at 9 p.m, as an example. So that way of communicating is super important, because sometimes it doesn't matter what you say, it's actually how you say it. And I don't think necessarily we always pay enough attention to that. So, yeah.
Great insight. So I was just thinking like it's a parallel with meetings.
Yeah.
I don't like meetings. So, we have them. They're part of our lives. But it's not like I'm a big fan of them. And the reason why is that many times they are not prepared properly. And I think it's kind of the same way. We can see it at scale, obviously, with the return to work from the office, because it's not necessarily clear what's going to happen during that meeting. What's going to happen if I go back to the office and work from there? What should be the outcomes? What should I bring? Right? So it's like you're going to a party. What should I bring? Is the first thing you ask, right? So what should I bring? You're coming to the party. So what should I bring when I'm coming back to the office? And what are you expecting from me? What's the general expectation? What's going to happen in a week, a month, a year or so? So there's got to be a reasoning behind it. Whenever management decides upon something and they say, okay, we're going to open a new office in Bucharest, for instance, there is a reasoning behind that, and people don't necessarily doubt about it, right? Or they don't challenge it. Well, maybe some do, but it's not like a general uprise, right? So the difference is that when you decide that everybody's going to be working back from the office, the impact is immediate upon a lot of people. Do you think a multi-staged approach is like the best? So it's like a warm-up. We get the first, we go for 1 or 2 days, and then you just increase the number. Is that something that you've seen happening and with a reasonable success?
Yeah, and I think it's all about, again, it goes back to change management around what are you doing today and what's your expectation longer term? Because if you're doing 2 days already, to flip up to 3 is not really a big change, right? But if you're doing none and then suddenly you're going to say you need to do 3, that's just too much. So that approach of going to the office, setting up things, connection points when you get to the office, like pre-setting meetings or breakfast or lunches, whatever it might be as a team, to encourage people to come back as well, I think is a really nice approach. But also giving people flexibility to know you can come in for 3 hours in a day, for example, if that makes it easier, so that you're really working through that whole approach with all of your colleagues, because there might be reasons why a colleague doesn't want to be in for the full day. It's maybe leaving their child for the first time, as an example, it could be, or leaving a pet that they've bought in lockdown that they didn't think that one through. You know what I mean? It could be all manner of things. So I think the more flexibility you have around the timeline for when it has to be implemented by, I think the better. You've hit the nail on the head there.
Absolutely. So I was thinking, because you mentioned well-being earlier, some would would agree that companies are to some extent responsible of balancing employees' well-being and the whole back to work thingy, back to working from the office.
Yeah.
Just to be like, so how do you do that? I mean, you mentioned Pat. You mentioned obviously kids, growing, going through different stages. Also, people suffering different transformations. Let's call them, some for the better, some for the worse. So how do you actually do that? Because it is like a myriad of things that can go on which you are completely oblivious of because you can't know what's going on to people's lives. Not that they would be much more obvious when you would be working in the same room, but it's entirely invisible, right? When you do this in a virtual environment. So getting back to the question, how can organizations actually balance their business needs, because they are obvious, right? That's the reason why a company exists, and the individual's well-being.
Yeah, do you know what? It isn't that difficult in the sense of making time for well-being is super important. So that could be a manager sitting with their employee and just having a well-being check-in once a month, just saying, how is everything? How's your workload? Are you managing to find time to take a lunch break? Like all of the basics of what well-being is. I think, unfortunately, again, people try to operate with this blanket approach of saying, it's better to come into the office as an example because you'll be surrounded by people and you're going to feel better because we can see you, we can check in with you, etc. But for some people, being around lots of people, like if you're a bit introverted, can be quite challenging. So I think the most important thing is managers meeting regularly with their colleagues to say, or their teammates, to ask them how they're feeling. And you know what it's like. Sometimes people won't feel open to have a conversation. They might feel scared to say if there's, a challenge going on or whatever you, but that builds over time and the trust will grow with the line manager as long as there's regular conversations and there's actions, or maybe just listening, depending on what the person needs at that time. But you know what it's like in lockdown, we saw some people's well-being went really bad during lockdown where, they were eating bad foods, drinking maybe too much, etc. But then on the flip side, there was other people who really catapulted their well-being during that time because they had extra time on their hands, they weren't commuting, etc. So I think it's really difficult to make broad statements around, because you see some companies now saying getting back to the office is better for your well-being because you're leaving the fridge as an example at home. But for me personally, I find it very challenging with a long commute as well to make sure that I'm balancing my well-being and doing everything else that I need to do. So yeah, I think it's very unique to each individual. But definitely that manager having those regular conversations is the ticket to make it as easy or as the best that it can be.
Sound advice. And I was thinking now, this sort of blanket approaches never really seem to work. Not necessarily in this particular case, but like in general.
Yeah.
There are so many moving parts. And you've been advising a lot of companies during this process and during this change management process. So how do you actually explain them, and how to put this? How do they transform them into action? Because on in principle it sounds good, right?
Yeah.
Let's not have like a blanket approach. Let's go more maybe more granular. How does this really happen, like in practice?
Yeah. So usually I think the best approach is always to, if you were going to start and decide from the very start, like how are we going to work going forward, I would always advocate for sending out a survey to all colleagues to say what, how would they like to work in the office and at home, etc., to get sentiment of employees, run focus groups to find out how people feel, like why, explain the themes basically that are in the survey and ask people for their independent version of why that result might be the way it is, and then present that back to a leadership team to come to an alignment and an agreement around how people should work going forward. Those are the most successful transformations that I've seen around how people work. But I have found that happening a lot more with the smaller companies. So the SMEs, the kind of medium-sized companies, they seem to operate with that approach a lot more. I think for whatever reason, bigger sort of global companies find it much harder to do that. And I don't know why that is, whether they're scared about what the results might be, I don't know. But it seems to be a harder process to kick that off in larger organizations. So I might get called in to do a team agreement as an example. So that would be creating a workshop with all of the relevant team and working through like what a day in the life looks like for those team members. So asking them to tell me, what tasks do you do on a daily basis? What equipment do you use? Who do you tend to meet with, etc.? Are you in regular meetings? Like just asking random questions, and we build out what a day in the life would look like. And then we work through as a team, like which one of those activities would be better to do in the office versus that activity being done in a third space or at home, or somewhere else, wherever that might be. And then we just agree that those meetings are the ones that are going to be done at home, and then the other ones are the ones that need to be done in the office. And then we look at how often do those meetings happen or those activities happen, and then that drives how often people should be in the office. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the process. And then it's regular check-ins sort of every quarter just to see how people are getting on, see if people are going back into old habits, like you said, putting the headphones on, sitting by themselves in the office, etc. But yeah, that for me is the way that you get everybody together and agree upon, in a common goal. And I was chatting to someone the other day around, what's good for us isn't always good for other people. So I think we need to have that awareness as well that, when we make a decision around how we want to work, we also have to be considerate of others. So I always liken it to like, what do I want, me versus we? And we should always be thinking of the we. And at the end of the day, the company that you work for pays your salary. So if they ask you to come in 3 days a week, you come in 3 days a week, you put a smile on your face and you do what is required. But I think ultimately, you know that when you're part of something bigger, like an incredible organisation that you might have the pleasure of working in, why would you not want to come in, meet people, contribute, do all the things that you do in the office? I don't really understand that element. Do you know what I mean? And I think sometimes managers don't want to have that conversation with their employees, but I think sometimes it's important to be kind of clear around, okay, you're doing a facilities role, you're managing the HVAC, the air conditioning system. It's physically impossible for you to do that from home. We haven't got a digital twin. There's no capabilities to do that. Yeah. You have to be in the office. And if you don't want to be in the office, then maybe this isn't the right job for you, company for you, etc. And knock that on the head straight away, because there's certain roles you're never going to get full equality across roles because of, doing that blanket approach is not going to work for a manager who has people in a facilities team. They're always going to come off wrong if you turn around and say they're going to work in the office 1 day a week. Because the minute that manager says, oh, you can't, then they look bad. Do you know what I mean? So it's that whole thing of really understanding the roles, the capabilities, and like why people need to be in versus why they can stay at home. So yeah, very complex.
No, indeed it is. So thanks for shedding a light on the process behind it. And I was just thinking now, if for smaller companies or SMEs as you call them, the process might be easier. I'm just wondering if it's scalable for like large enterprise. So the workshops, or is it more along the lines of we get an understanding of how things are and then we just expand it company-wide?
Yeah, and I think it is scalable in the sense of, I've done quite a few workshops with big organisations, multinational companies around activities, broadly speaking, that are really good to do in the office. Like I mentioned at the very start, where we talked about well-being chats, development, training, all those kind of things are much better to do in the office. And I don't think anyone can really disagree with that. I mean, the science backs it up, the data's there to support it. So you can definitely do those kind of thematic things and hope that people, like line managers, give managers takeaways to take away to go, okay, well, let's give this a go. Because, when we mentioned earlier on about the well-being thing, there's been times where line managers have been really good at well-being, managing the well-being of their teams. And then they can't understand when their colleagues say, oh, I don't think they take well-being seriously. And the manager's always like, I don't understand how you can say that, because I've given you, I let you go on time. I'm staying in the office, let's say, or I'm not having a lunch break. But what they forget is they're role modeling the way the behaviours and the actions are. So that can leave colleagues going, well, he doesn't take a lunch or she doesn't take a lunch, therefore I probably shouldn't, because maybe it looks like I'm slacking if I'm not taking a lunch break. So I think it's that whole thing of like, if a manager comes in, doesn't talk with their team, sits in meeting rooms all day, they have to be aware that people are watching them, and they need to role model like meaningful conversations and having those moments that really matter in the office, rather than again defaulting to work that could be done from home. So yeah, it's a balance, and when you're a leader, everybody's always watching you whether you like it or not. So yeah,
there's a lot of expectations, right? And this is something that I've heard one of the leaders working in learning and development, and she was saying that for a large, really large company, and she was like, when the crisis in 2007, around 2007 happened, companies tended to actually cut the budgets for managers training.
right.
And so we have then a new bunch of managers who actually didn't know how to manage because they haven't been trained to do so. And they were just thrown into the middle of something and say, do the work, manage these people. Some of them naturally had some skills, and they've done a great job. Some of them not so much. But the problem is that the tendency was to keep those budgets really, really low. And the effect is obvious in some cases. And I was thinking right now, nobody has actually learned in school, in any management school for that matter, how do you manage teams, in a hybrid environment? Because there wasn't such a thing as hybrid environment. People would be working sometimes from home, but that was more like the exception rather than the rule, like the general rule. And now I'm thinking, how do we actually help managers do the proper job? Because they, as you mentioned, and I think this is like super important insight, everybody's looking up at them saying, okay, what's she doing? What's he doing? And probably I should do the same, right? They are role modeling.
Yeah. And you know what, you've hit the nail on the head when it comes to giving people training. I think if you don't give managers proper training in this area, no wonder it gets so confusing and causes so many problems. I mean, you only need to look at a hybrid meeting, for example. Like, if you don't set up team norms for how a hybrid meeting could work or should work, you always have the people sat virtually being ignored, don't you, in a meeting? It's as simple as that. Whereas when you give a manager training and you say, for example, that person who's remote puts their hand up and always goes first, and somebody else manages to make sure they're, overseeing all of that, then you have a really successful meeting that's hybrid and works really well. But if you don't do any of that training, you have a hybrid meeting which doesn't work. And then the knock-on effect is the manager wants everybody in the office because the hybrid meeting didn't work. But actually what it is we didn't get trained on how to actually run an effective hybrid meeting. So I think there's definitely things like, training on how to run a hybrid meeting, managing your team remotely as well, because unfortunately, if you don't have that trust with some of your colleagues, it is very difficult to manage people remotely if the trust isn't there. Because, if you need an answer on a document and the person doesn't come back to you straight away, unfortunately, human behaviours, managers go up this inference ladder of thinking the worst. And 9 times out of 10, it isn't the worst, but, it makes it more difficult. If you start working hybrid from a place of trust and the manager and everybody has good relationships in the team, you don't get problems because people just trust that, the work is going to get done, the output's there, and they're happy to work, remotely, hybrid, however they want to work, or in the office. People are less bothered about location. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the anxiety from a manager standpoint around not having people in the office is, if we really dug into it, it's that lack of trust that sometimes can exist within a team.
Rightly so. And I was just thinking now, because you mentioned right at the beginning of our conversation about communication, and going actually back to square one, and we have some basic rules in communication which sometimes we all seem to forget about. You got the message, you got who's sending the message to whom, and then you have the channel. And one of the channels right now is this hybrid meeting, right? Which is not something that we've discussed about when I was in school. But it's a reality, and it's part of our reality right now. And going even further, the transformations during the pandemic times, and then soon after, there is a transformation in the office itself, in like the physical office. So you mentioned many times it's like a big open space right now.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's great for collaboration, sometimes not so much. How does a physical office need to look right now so it's attractive to people? I'm not talking about gimmicks and things like that. Probably they are useful and attractive, but what are like the mandatory, the should haves things in the office today?
Yeah, of course. Do you know what's happening now is obviously nobody has a fixed desk. So when they come into the office, if you're only working a couple of days a week in the office, it's criminal really, isn't it, to have a desk empty for you to come in twice a week. I mean, it's a luxury we don't have. So most people are now working in activity-based working, and they're just coming in, parking at a desk for a day and then moving on. And just because of that new approach, how do you make sure that it's ergonomic, the desk is ergonomically safe for people to work at? The only way really you can do that is with sit-stand desks, to make sure that when you come in, if you're small and a little bit short like I am, you can move the desk down. And if you're a little bit taller, you can move the desk up. I've seen companies working in activity-based working, but not having that set up. And that makes it very difficult because the office straight away becomes uncomfortable if you're a little bit bigger than the norm or a little bit smaller than the norm. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is different types of spaces to account for different ways of working and different personalities, really. So the office, the open plan office, really suits the extrovert in the sense of, the people who get energy off other people. They love the open plan workplaces. But if you're a little bit more introverted, like I am, where I need time, I recharge by myself, basically, it can be a bit overwhelming sometimes. So having spaces that are quieter, where you can kind of go off, carry on working, but feel like you're not going to get interrupted and you can recharge a little bit, those are really important. And then the last thing is kind of the meeting room setup, is making sure that the technology in those rooms works for hybrid, because you're never going to have a meeting now where everybody's in the same room. So how do you make sure that the room feels like if you're not there, you still feel part of it? And if you're in there, you can see everybody that's also at the meeting. So very simple things like putting 2 screens, for example, in a meeting room really helps. One that you can share the deck with, and the other that you can share the actual faces of everybody that's in the meeting that might be sitting there remotely. And the other thing as well, just in terms of behaviours, is having somebody to monitor those hybrid meetings is really important. So not the person whose meeting it is, but someone else in the room who's going to watch when a hand goes up or when the chat comes up or things like that. Because obviously when you're in the meeting room, you can't see any of that. Whereas if you're at home or working from a third space, all of that is easy to see. So I think that in a nutshell, and again, quiet spaces to jump into a booth, to have a phone call, etc., I think are really important. Because now, like, we're competing with people's homes. So as a workplace professional now, it's really hard because people's homes are set up exactly how they want them, if they have the money, that is, So we've got more competition than we've ever had before. And I think a lot of companies are forgetting that and just expecting people to come back. But actually, the environment they're coming back to might be worse than their home office now, because we've had 2 and a bit years of buying our own desk, getting our, I see your chair there, like setting yourself up with a perfect chair and everything. If you were to go into an office, I would probably infer that it would be a worse chair, for example, than what you have there. So it's that kind of thing that I think we need to be mindful of.
Absolutely. So, I was just smiling because I've read the other day, there was a guy on Reddit and he started a thread of discussion saying they mandated back to work to the office. And now I have to go, but guess what? My former chair, which used to have like 6 wheels, now has only 5. And it's fabulous, but not so much. And then, the coffee is absolutely the worst. And, by contrast, I'm a big coffee lover and I have like really, really good machine at home. And obviously, many times when I go out, in restaurants and such, and the coffee is not that good. But you can imagine in the office it's even worse normally because, you can't please anyone. So a lot of things have stayed in the past to some extent. But then you're expecting people to come over there and be happy about it. And they obviously they're going to see every little thing. And what's immediately obvious is the comfort. Now, I would use the opportunity for a little self-promote because at Yarooms, this is one of the things that we actually handle. So when you're booking a desk, you look and say, where's Bex working from? Because I want to work with her on a project today, so I'm going to get a desk right next to her. Or I need two screens, for instance, if I'm working on something else. Or a specific meeting room which has like 10 seats and the capabilities of hosting a proper hybrid meeting room, sorry. So there are things that I think we can handle with technology, but spot on with the comfort that we manage to actually have in our home office versus an average office in our office building. And this is why exactly I was asking what are the changes that companies need to be aware that they need to go through, so whatever they bring to the table is a little on par with what people have at home.
Yeah.
Right.
But you know what though, as you mentioned there around the coffee, I'm a big coffee lover as well. Again, I've got a lovely machine at home, and when you go into any office, it's never as good, is it? But it's that whole thing as well around the cost. Like, I know it's not the employer's perspective, it's not the employer's problem, right? That, you're having to buy a coffee out because the coffee is not very good in the office, or you're buying a sandwich or what have you. But it's a lot of money on top of the normal, people have had that luxury of not having to pay for the commute, pay for the breakfast, pay for the lunch, etc., clothes to wear to the office, like all this stuff that goes with it. And to say that, you used to do it before, you just need to do it now, it's a loose argument. There needs to be more thought around that people are going to have more friction or more stumbling blocks in place around the kind of coming back to the office that stop you wanting to come to the office as well. It's not necessarily the fact that they don't want to come in. It's just, that's £50 a day in a train ticket that they weren't spending before, as an example. So yeah, there's many reasons why people might be reluctant to come in, not that they don't want to do the job. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and also, we have to acknowledge the fact that some companies actually provided some budgets to people to actually arrange their home office so it's as good as they want it to be.
Yeah,
so
which is fantastic.
On top of, yeah, absolutely. This on top of the fact that you weren't spending so much because of not needed the commute.
Yeah.
And also I was thinking that I probably have a few new shirts. I haven't worn, but I was kind of expecting I would, but it's never been the case. And there was this funny episode in one of the series I watched the other night, and the first day people came back to working in the hospital, the manager goes like, oh, we have the new pants day. And there was one of the nurses who was in the pajamas, the pajama pants, and it was like, oh, I need to get used to this again. Right? So, well, obviously an exaggeration, but still it's
still funny.
It's funny and part of the process. So obviously we discussed about some friction points, right, in when we are asking people to come back and work from the office. But what would be some benefits that you've noticed, right? So you've helped companies through this process, change management and stuff, and people returned in the physical offices. What would be some of the benefits that you've noticed and which actually people acknowledged?
Oh, do you know what? I think the number one benefit that people have found is being able to get hold of somebody. Like if you send an email, there's always an ability for people to be able to ignore that email for a little while, aren't they? But if you see them in the kitchen or you see them at the tea point and you say, oh, I sent an email last week, you might not have seen it, but can you just have a look over it or whatever? Things get resolved really quickly, face to face. It's very hard to sort of ignore someone when they're in your face, kind of thing. So I think that has been the number one thing that people have said. And I think secondly, people have loved that kind of coming together at work, having lunches together, going out for dinner, all of that kind of stuff. People have really, really enjoyed. I think some people have said that it's not like it used to be, in the sense of, you might have gone out more in the evenings, whereas now people, when they do come to the office, want to sort of go home. So I've heard a lot more of people having breakfast together and doing different stuff like that that makes it feel worthwhile. What else have I heard? Oh, I've heard this is quite a nice one actually. I've heard like because obviously when everyone's working at home, you end up getting really close with your immediate team because they see your house, they see everything that's going on. They might meet one of your kids coming in the middle of a call or something. But you stop talking to the wider teams in big companies because you might not necessarily need to speak to finance because you're not working together on a project, let's say. So I think when people have come back into the office, they've really loved reconnecting with people that they don't work with, but are obviously still part of the same company. So I've heard some really nice stories around that where, people have run marathons or done different activities in that time where they've been apart and they just didn't realise because obviously they weren't regularly talking to one another. So I think that kind of being part of something bigger, I think that's really, it makes a company seem smaller almost when you're all in the one place, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. No, I was also thinking about, many times one of the arguments in favor of working from the office is like the collaboration, right? So I think it kind of depends, and it's probably we have like a divided, if we ask people, we have like a 50-50 sort of response. Do you work better, when you collaborate on something in a virtual environment rather than the office? So I'm a little bit more old school in that. And, and one of the things that I've noticed is that when we were working together, me and my team on something, the results tend to pop up rather sooner when we are face-to-face or when we are physically in the same space. And then no matter the apps or the technology that we employ in trying to do so in a hybrid fashion, for instance. And I was trying to figure out why. Is it my bias? Could be, obviously. Is it something that I've been used to do in this fashion, or is it something else? And then it struck me at some point. So we had this virtual or hybrid, hybrid, I think it's called, sort of meeting. And once it ended and we said goodbye, people, turned off the connection and everybody kind of got back to whatever they were doing. But the ones that we were in the same room, we lingered for longer. This is like one of the habits from back in the day, right?
Yeah.
So the meeting is over, but and what you're doing tonight, you go up for some beers or something, or you want to go run that marathon in the weekend. And some ideas popped up just then. And what happened was that the guys, connecting from various places weren't aware of that. And if you don't go through the proper process of documenting everything, including those bits which were happening after the meeting was officially over, then it's a loss, right, for everybody involved. So I think it's a little bit tricky, actually. But I've seen some transformations. People who are like, I'm never ever gonna go back in working from the office. Being one of those, like, I'm looking forward to seeing you in the office. Because it's, whenever we meet, there is a sort of an energy or like a synergy there that you don't necessarily feel when working remotely.
Yeah.
And I think this is not advertised enough, right? So that sort of connection.
Sorry, go on, Cosmin.
Yeah, so I was thinking that maybe we should speak more about this, right? And the potential of ideas popping up when we are together.
So I have a bit of a theory on this one, that I think if you're in a creative job, I feel like being together is a way to really be creative, in the sense of, for me, creativity happens when I'm not necessarily thinking about the problem. I could just be having a shower, going for a run, like doing something completely different to the problem, and the solution comes to me. And it'll happen all the time. For whatever reason, the shower is my place where I have a shower and then I've solved everything in there, So I think having space for creativity and those type of problem solving in a creative manner, I think doing that face to face is really helpful. The only caveat to that, I'd say, is if you've got a challenge that you need to overcome and you're doing it virtually, a huge benefit that I've seen virtually, which I've not seen in person, it could still happen in person, by the way, but I've not seen this happen in person very often, is if you're in a virtual meeting and you use, say, a digital whiteboard or whatever it might be, and you give everybody an opportunity to type an answer, you get answers from people who wouldn't speak up in a normal meeting, or wouldn't necessarily feel like, they might be the intern, they could be a junior member of staff or whatever. They wouldn't necessarily contribute face to face as much. So I always think when you're doing a face-to-face meeting, having that kind of like ability to, type an answer or to share an answer in an anonymous way is really helpful, because unfortunately when you're in a room with people, you sometimes get that situation. I'm sure you've heard of the acronym, but it's the HIPPO. So the highest paid person unfortunately takes over. So that's the kind of two themes that I thought are quite helpful around having space for creativity, lack of agenda. That's really helpful. But then when it comes to problem solving and being structured and getting input from everybody, it's creating that mechanism. Doesn't matter where it is, whether it's in person or virtually, but creating those ways to get the best out of everybody.
Fair point. I have an antidote to that, and it's like I'm appointing volunteers to speak.
Yeah,
so
which is good.
I tend to figure out who's gonna not contribute and who's gonna stay silent for various number of reasons. Maybe they're more introverts, or they are the newcomers and they say, I won't speak because I don't know what reaction I might trigger or so on. So that's why I kind of I ask.
Yeah, which is good.
And say, you need to say something about that. But at fair point, I mean, I get where you're going. Now, I was just thinking that some companies have changed a number of times their strategy, and the reason why is that it hasn't worked in the first place. Then they tried again, and it hasn't worked. So what's the best approach? I mean, obviously there is a setback that you encounter with every, let's say, failed attempt. How should companies deal with those setbacks?
So I guess here now I've got to go in the sport angle, because me and I love sport. If you're going to try for a world record in running, swimming, whatever activity you might be doing, you're going to fail. It doesn't mean you give up. And I think, unfortunately, this is where sometimes people revert back to the old way. So if you go back to that sports analogy, it'd be like, I've ate really well, I've managed my well-being, I've done my movement, everything like that, and it didn't work. So therefore, I'm going to go and eat burgers again. It just wouldn't happen. You wouldn't have that approach. Yet in business, in hybrid working, we go, this isn't working, it's causing too much noise, we're just going to default back to the old ways of working. But we've actually progressed forward so well from how we were working before. We've leveled the playing field when it comes to, working mums, single dads, caregivers. There's less microaggressions by hybrid working, less toxicity in workplaces, etc. And people have got better work-life balance. The only thing you have to really manage if people are working too much at home by themselves is that loneliness thing that's going on. So I think keeping with it and sticking in that chaos and the mess of it all a little bit, but using people like change managers and external people or even internal people who are going to take it seriously to really work through all the things we've discussed will help change that way of working and make it better. Unfortunately, it's always a case, and I've been doing change management for years now, whenever projects aren't going well, that's usually when they call the change managers. Whereas if they called the change managers in at the start, the project would work well. Do you see what I mean?
Absolutely. It's like the third time it doesn't work, I say, we need to call a professional.
We've got to call someone. We've got to call someone in. So I think it's sticking with things. Whenever I do workplace transformation, so if I'm supporting a company that's having a refurb done in their office, I'm really, really quite adamant that there has to be a change freeze at the end, which is at least 3 months where nothing changes, to just get people used to the new spaces and new areas, etc. Because what you find is it takes people a long time to adapt to something that's new. And, some silly little things like sitting on a comfy sofa, some colleagues are really worried about that because they think it looks like they're not working. Like a manager's got busy, is worrying about other stuff. They're not even looking at them. But for whatever reason, once they see their manager sitting on the sofa, it's like, oh, okay, this is acceptable. I can do that as well. And it starts. And all too often we go, oh, we don't need the sofas. No one's sitting on them. We'll just get rid of them. So it's things like that where people take a bit of time to adapt to things. And just because it's a bit uncomfortable, we shouldn't just revert back to our comfort zone where, to be honest, what good happens in your comfort zone? Not a lot, basically.
Absolutely. We discussed a little bit about how the office should be and comfy things. such as sofas, I mean, they play a role. But if you're only there for like 10 minutes and you don't see anyone sitting on, it's like, yeah, let's get rid of them.
Yeah.
Let's get like a big blackboard instead. But I wanted to ask you, what's the role that technology plays? I mean, obviously, we're looking at making the office comfortable, suitable for whatever activity needs to go on there. But what are the technologies that we should be also looking for?
I see. Do you know what? I'm a massive advocate of technology, but I'm a massive advocate of technology that's thought of it through the user experience. So that whole like UX design is so important, because I think whilst technology is great, like say, for example, you have a desk booking system or something like that, for people who are commuting in, they need that security to know that the desk is there, etc. So that's great. But if you think of it, it's another step or another piece of friction in a person's day to go into the office. So now they've got to book their train ticket, they've got to now book their desk, they've now got to get their food ready if they don't want to spend money. Like these are all things that add friction into their day. So I think any technology which helps support the whole like ease of everything is definitely something that companies should be rolling out. And I don't think there's any like one solution. That is also a problem from a workplace perspective. You can never really get one solution that works for everything. So then the user experience gets a bit clunky because they're having to go to this system for this and this system for this, and So I think the one thing I'd love to see, if I'm allowed like a kind of dream within the technology space within workplace, is I would love to see it become more like, and I know obviously proper techie people will be shouting at me, but I'm a consumer, right? I love the way Apple is so simple, it's streamlined, it's all together, and like I'd love to see something like that coming into workplace where, if I go into a booth and the temperature's too hot, I can turn it down on my phone or whatever it might be to make that space as good as it can be for me. Or for example, my phone knows that there's something in my phone that knows exactly the height that I want the desk at, and it just sets it all up for me when I first come in. Like stuff like that. I think unfortunately, a lot of the technologies that we do see rolled out, they add a bit of friction rather than supporting, the experience. As an example, food ordering of your coffee when you go in and it's ready when you come in. Like that's the kind of stuff that I want to see. Or, you're sitting on the 7th floor, and I know you're on the 7th. I don't know you're on the 7th floor, but the system says, Bex, you should book on the 7th because Cosmin's there and he's your mate, like that kind of stuff. So more intuitive and supportive of the whole experience. So, yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, some things are easier than others. And I was just thinking right now about this puzzle. This is actually one of the features that we have. And one of the things that we know about is that there's a myriad of applications, of systems, of things you need to log into, check in into, and so on.
Yeah.
And one of the best ways to actually get people to use whatever technology you are selling, or not even selling, but even implementing, is that it doesn't have to add a layer of friction. So it's got to integrate and play well with the others that you already have. So, and this is one of the challenges that we see normally is like, oh no, not another one. Right, so now I need to do this into this system, and then I need to use my badge, and then I need to check in there, and then it's like that's half an hour already. I haven't even started doing anything. But on the other hand, you have a lot of benefits, and I'll just give you an example. So there's this law firm, and one of the issues that they had was like when they were coming back from the court, they needed a desk or a meeting room, just go sign some papers or do something really quickly or meet a client. And the problem was that they had an office on multiple floors, and they would land on one of the floors, just hover around, no offices.
No office, yeah.
No desks. Then go to the next, and frustration appears, obviously. And eventually, at the end of the day, it's a matter of money as well, because, instead of billable hours, these were like wasted hours doing stuff or not finding the parking spot. So one of the things that I think technology manages to actually ease out is, eliminate this potential worry that I'm not going to find the desk.
Yeah.
Or I'm not going to find the parking spot. I'm on my way, so I just pull out my phone and say, yeah, well, I get this desk, looks good. It's got everything I need. And I got like an electric car, so there's my charging spot. I can book that, for instance. So some things, from our perspective as well, can get easier and, more fluid in terms of process, of course.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's like an inflation of things that you can add on and add on and add on. And many times, it doesn't have to be like company-wide. It can be only like department-wide. Like I'm getting this note-taking tool, and then I'm getting this hybrid meeting sort of technology and everything else. And it can be overwhelming. And I'm really, really a big fan. If you whenever you advise, say, keep it minimal, and whatever doesn't add to the whole experience in a good way, just get rid of it.
Yeah.
Because I think, going back to the basics is something that we definitely need.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. It's sometimes these things are brought out and they're kind of they're solving for something that happens maybe 10% of the time, and then it puts a hassle on everybody else. Like I've seen examples where like a senior stakeholder's got frustrated about not being able to get a meeting room or whatever and then they've taken the room off the booking system and they've got free use of it, and then everybody else just gets frustrated because they're like, there's no rooms available and that one's sat empty, but I'm not sure if I can go in or not because I can't see the booking system. So it's things like that, but that's not what what technology is there for. It's there to make your life easier, not, you know what I mean, not just someone deciding, no, actually I'm just going to take it off because I don't want to follow the process. So yeah,
take advantage of position, right? And this is something that I've seen happening. So even long before the technology allowed us to do bookings and stuff, there was mostly an Excel file which was printed.
Yeah.
And you would just put there your name and say, yeah, I want this meeting room from 2:00, and then somebody higher up in management was like, I need this room from like 2, and who's this? Cosmin? Nah, just
take over.
Take over. It's like, it's weird. Then you go, it's like, I had the booking. It's like, I got a meeting. It's important. And what can you do? Nothing much, right? But then, things have changed a little bit in terms of what you can do with technology. And that I think is funny though. Yeah. Wanted to ask you something. So obviously we could chat for hours, but wanted to ask you if you've encountered a situation where companies felt that the actual physical place or the location of the office wasn't working anymore, and they've decided to change. Because I've read this really interesting piece on donut cities, and the main idea is that starting with the pandemic, people kind of went away from the center of the city, and companies as well many times, because it didn't make any sense to have an empty space you've been paying for in the middle and then just go to the outskirts. And people would move outside the office, outside the cities, because they wanted be closer to nature, have a little plot, things like that. Is it something that you've encountered, like companies moving actual offices in different places because they were more accessible or easily accessible?
Not necessarily with the clients that I've been working with, but I think it comes down to lease ends, doesn't it, in terms of real estate leases? Because if they don't have the ability, because obviously you might have the ability to sublet, in which case that would be an option, but a lot of contracts don't allow you, especially in the UK, to even do that. So I haven't seen many examples of that, but what I have seen is a lot of downsizing, and then options to use like co-working spaces that might be nearer to colleagues' homes. So you always get, don't you, a pocket of people living in a similar area just outside of London or just outside of Paris or whatever, and using these kind of like co-working spaces to be able to still connect but not have to go all the way to the office. That's something that I've seen happening a lot more, whereas in the past, companies used to be a little bit funny about using spaces where other companies might be, whereas now it feels like people are more open to that. And I think they're aware that, before people were doing that in a coffee shop, which was probably even worse, you know what I mean, as opposed to co-working. So yeah, those are the examples that I've seen.
It just reminded me of a meme I've seen recently, and it was like somebody working from their home office, and there was a cat, sitting on the same chair. It's like, in every home office, there is a pet that knows everything about everything in your company. So it's like no secrets anymore from that perspective. But in terms of information security, probably it's tighter when you work from
Yeah.
home rather than Starbucks or whatever sort
Yeah.
of open networks and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know that, when I've worked for companies before, we had really strict policies around what you could share in those spaces, how you worked, privacy screens, webcam covers, the whole shebang.
Yeah.
But a lot of companies aren't even thinking about that. You know what I mean? And somebody can overhear something, and the rest is kind of history of situations that can occur. So yeah, I think people are getting a bit wiser to that now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as they say, with age comes wisdom. So probably like, time passes and we figure out some things are more important than others.
Yeah.
So just to end on a positive note, what would be like your recommendation for a company that contemplates right now implementing a strategy which actually calls people back to the office
What would be
some
my
time away?
strategy?
Yeah, what would
Yeah.
be the strategy and the first things to consider prior to doing anything about it?
Yeah, I think if there's a reason that they want to come back to the office, I think it's really important to look at the office and see if it fits those reasons. So it might be, say for example, trying to think of a scenario. Say for example, you are a company that is all about the community and inviting the community into the space, etc. That makes logical sense to have a physical space where community can come in and everyone can, connect with your colleagues and your workmates, etc. And if that's the case, is the environment fit for purpose? So I'd basically review the environment and match and hopefully check that it matches whatever the company vision is, whatever the company mission statement is, and make sure it's aligned. And then secondly, have those conversations with colleagues to explain why you're doing this, why you want people back, and what you believe the benefits are going to be. Definitely have that two-way conversation and listen to colleagues if there's any concerns, try to overcome any concerns. And I think thirdly, I've very limited success has been when companies have tried to just get people back in the office, but they've made no changes to the floor plate in the office. So I also think that, this whole process also needs a rework usually of the physical office to make sure that it's fit for purpose in this new way of working. And again, the technology, what technology do you need to actually make it all happen and work, and make sure that you get change management in bed with the project really early to make sure that there's somebody there to support implementation of the new technology, implementation of the new workspaces, and how things are going to work longer term. So I think that's it. It's not unfortunately a quick, just do this. It's a long process. And I think that it should be treated like any big project that you would roll out, and you need stakeholder alignment across the whole business. So this isn't a HR project and a facilities project. This is senior stakeholders of an organisation project. Do you know what I mean? To make sure that it's given the kudos and the attention that it deserves. Because it isn't as simple, as we said at the very start, there's no crisis right now. So it's not as easy as it was to get everybody home. Now there's other options and people don't have to just follow, So
Right.
I think it just is making sure that people realise the enormity of the project and how much work is going to go into it if it's going to be successful.
Absolutely. Wealth of information right there. Yeah, thank you very much, Bex, for sharing all these insights with us.
Oh, absolute pleasure. Like I said, thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, hope to have you on the podcast soon.
Oh, I will be there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.